Good afternoon. My paper will focus today on the deaths and afterlives of two migrant tribal chiefs from the 19th century, the Lakota chief, Sitting Bull, and the Nama chief, Hendrick Vittboy. Both were border-crossing figures, both forced to abandon their traditional homelands. Both killed when they rebelled against colonizers and denied a proper burial. My analysis is situated in the shadowlands of Derrida's ontology. Through Derrida, I will argue that the ghosts of Sitting Bull and Hendrik Witbooi and the spirit of their resistance against what the West foisted on them in the name of capitalism and democracy are still on the move. Sitting Bull needs little introduction. During his lifetime, the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, duly signed on the occasion pictured here, granted the Black Hills of South Dakota to the Sioux tribes. When white settlers crossed the borders to prospect for gold, war broke out. Sitting Bull led his tribe north across the border to Canada, but faced with mass starvation, they returned 4 years later. While being held captive at the Standing Rock Reservation in South Dakota, he clashed with authorities from the Office of Indian Affairs, represented by Agent James McLaughlin. In 1890, the spiritual revival movement known as the Ghost Dance gave fleeting hope to Plains Indians who believed that songs and ceremonies could bring back their dead and ensure the restoration of their lands. McLaughlin sent Indian police to arrest Sitting Bull at his small cabin. When Sitting Bull resisted the arrest, he was shot dead. 12 other men were killed in the ensuing gunfight, 6 of them Indian police officers, and 6 of them Sitting Bull's compatriots, so-called hostile Indians. The Indian policemen were buried with full military honors, and this photo was taken of the ceremony. Soon after, a pillar was erected, inscribed with their names and the following words. These men were killed in battle with hostile Indians while arresting Chief Sitting Bull. 43 policemen were opposed by 160 armed, fanatical ghost dancers. In stark contrast, the hostiles were buried in unmarked graves. At Fort Yates, the army surgeon responsible for the post-mortem on Sitting Bull's corpse stole a pair of leggings from the corpse and cut a lock of hair from Sitting Bull's head. These were held for many decades by the Smithsonian Museum. Only when he was done, Sitting Bull's body was buried without ceremony in a far corner of the reserve. 2 weeks later, the army brutally suppressed the ghost dance movement by attacking a group of Lakota at Wounded Knee. The dead were collected by wagon and then buried in a mass grave. Photographers accompanied the burial party. The photographs sold well and carried the story of the massacre at Wounded Knee worldwide. We had better, in order to protect our civilization, wipe these untamed and untamable creatures from the earth, wrote South Dakota newspaperman L. Frank Baum, the future author of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, in an editorial at the time. Let's turn our attention for the moment to Hendrik Vittboy, born 1 year earlier than Sitting Bull, in what is today known as South Africa. After succeeding his father as captain, he led the Witbooi Nama north to Southwest Africa, which was annexed as a colony by Germany in the 1880s. Members of the Herero tribe were subjected to violence, rape, and murder. The Nama did not escape unharmed. This is a German postcard of Nama captives being executed while German women and children look on. The Herero rebelled in 1904 and Lothar von Trotha issued his notorious extermination order. Horrified by the treatment of his erstwhile enemies, the Herero, Witbooi declared war and the smaller Nama tribe joined the uprising. This led to von Trotha's notorious proclamation in 1905. The mighty and powerful German emperor will grant mercy to the Hottentot people and will spare the lives of those who surrender. Those few who do not submit will suffer the same fate as the Hereros, who in their blindness believed that they could carry on successful war with the mighty German emperor. I ask you, where are all the Hereros today? Where are their chiefs? The Herero people have been annihilated, and the Hottentots will suffer the same fate if they do not surrender and give up their weapons. Witbooi was killed later that year on the battlefield. Fearing mutilation by his enemies, he was buried in a secret, forgotten grave near Volgras, which has never been rediscovered. What followed was the first genocide of the 20th century. By 1908, the German colonial government had killed 80% of the Herero and 50% of the Nama populations. Survivors were captured and deported to concentration camps. One of the most notorious of these was Shark Island. Here, Eugene Fischer, later a prominent Nazi scientist, conducted experiments on both the living, the barely living, and the dead. Female Nama prisoners were forced to boil heads of dead inmates and scrape remains of their skin and eyes with shards of glass. An estimated 300 skulls were sent from these concentration camps to Germany. The dead were buried in shallow, unmarked graves. They are still there. We had better wipe these creatures from the earth, wrote Frank Baum after Wounded Knee. The Herero people have been annihilated and the Hottentots will suffer the same fate, wrote François von Trotha. These apocalyptic pronouncements assume definitive endpoints and the exorcism of ghosts, specters, and spectrality. But one is never freed so easily from ghosts whose apparitions are all the fuller as one undertakes to reject or deny them, writes Pierre Machery in his analysis of Derrida. How do these ghosts make themselves known? We'll start with the graves and with those who say they are speaking for the dead. In Wounded Knee, McLaughlin had made it clear how the authorities wished the death of Sitting Bull to be remembered. The victors separated from the vanquished, a version of history sanctioned by the union of church, state, and army. But from the turn of the century, there were those who questioned the status quo. A missionary, Mary Collins, erected a small monument in memory of Sitting Bull and his friends where they were killed. She also managed to get the site where the hostiles were buried officially recognized as a cemetery. In 1915, under pressure of a local newspaper, Sitting Bull's grave was repaired and a new stone stele added. But when there was talk of relocating the body, Eugene Mossman, a successor of McLaughlin, declared, I recommend that Sitting Bull's dust remain where it is and where it should be, in a lonely grave, in plain view of the government school, the agency buildings, and the churches, all of which he fought. Mossman had a concrete slab poured over the grave and erected a new sign presenting Sitting Bull simply as medicine man, not a warrior or a leader. But more and more, his attitude seemed anachronistic. Photos of visitors to the grave testified to a new demonstration of reverence and atonement, with gazes directed toward the grave and hats in hand. In 1953, a group of businessmen, with the approval of relatives of Sitting Bull, exhumed the remains under cover of night and snuck the casket across the border to the South Dakota site of the Standing Rock Reservation. As the sun rose, they buried Sitting Bull near the town of Mowbridge. Soon after, they erected a memorial. But much was still unresolved. The Lakotas say that in 1986, many of them started dreaming about Sitting Bull. They discussed this amongst themselves and decided to institute an annual memorial rite in his honor. One of them explains, the rite was important because the Lakota usually do a wiping of the tears ceremony after a loss. But after Wounded Knee, we were a broken people. We were too damaged to do the wiping of the tears after a year. And really, we remained in mourning for those people who died for 100 years. The memorial rite happens annually, and yet the trauma associated with the unritual has not been resolved, and the unritualized spectre still haunts the living. We have plans for the future of my great-grandfather, says Ernie Lapointe in his Sitting Bull memoir. This is reminiscent of Derrida's insight, inspired by Hamlet, that ghosts dislocate time, so that time is out of joint. Last year, DNA tests proved conclusively that Ernie is the great-grandson of Sitting Bull, as he has maintained all along. A DNA sample for Sitting Bull was obtained from the lock of hair, which was returned by the Smithsonian to Ernie. My main goal is to be the voice of my great-grandfather, he says. There are others who also say they speak for Sitting Bull and the Wounded Knee dead. Those include legislators and activists calling on President Joe Biden to revoke the medals awarded to soldiers who participated in the killings at Wounded Knee. And we are Sitting Bull's people, said protesters in 2016 when they demonstrated against the Dakota crude oil access pipeline close to Wounded Knee. At the moment, the Lakota are staring down yet another encroachment on their historic lands, a 10,600-acre uranium mine proposed to be built in the Black Hills. According to Jameson, Derrida, when he writes about ghosts, is less interested in the hold of the past on the present than in what spectrality holds for the future, and in the apparition of the past in the act of provoking future action. The descendants of Sitting Bull point to the difficulties democratic free market economies are experiencing, including environmental degradation, and they ask questions about what this implies for the future. Here is Ruth Hopkins, a Lakota writer and lawyer. The greatest mistake the colonizers made was leaving even just one of us alive, because we are still ghost dancing. I remember those slaughtered at Wounded Knee, and I keep Sitting Bull's visions of hope alive. Our planet calls upon us now to cease the death and destruction wrought by an evil, unsustainable system of greed that promises to destroy all life on Mother Earth. And back to Hendrick Vittboy. Southwest Africa remained a German colony until it was made a League of Nations mandate of the Union of South Africa after World War I. When the mandate was terminated, South Africa remained illegally occupying the territory. During this time, Witbooi was vilified in many Afrikaans novels as a cunning, cruel warlord and the fanatical, deluded enemy of white Boers. Witbooi kept a diary in Dutch, which has survived and has been entered into the UNESCO memory of the World Register, but he is presented as illiterate and savage in these novels. They read like variations on Gustav Frensen's notorious novel Peter Moor's Vaart na Zuidwest, fiction arguing for the right to take the land away from Africans and to put it to use for European settlement. On the other hand, during Namibia's liberation struggle, Witbooi was an icon for PLAN, the People's Liberation Army of Namibia. When Namibia became independent in 1990, Witbooi's face was chosen to decorate the new banknotes. And President Sam Nujoma declared, "We, the new generation of the land of the brave, are inspired by Captain Hendrick Vittboy's revolutionary action in combat against the German imperialists." In Namibia, Hendrik Vittboy is still a principal reference point for identity construction. The date when he was killed in action is commemorated annually. It involves a symbolic reenactment of important events in his life, using up to 80 horse riders. For formal occasions, Nama traditional authorities still wear the traditional white headgear for which the tribe was named. Witbooi remembrance policy is geared explicitly towards emphasizing unattained communal ends, above all control of ancestral lands. It also involves referencing the colonial genocide and pursuing demands for reparation. In 2018, 90 Herero and Nama skulls were returned by the German government to Namibia. Hendrik Vittboy's Bible and his whip were also returned. Last year, Germany finally recognized committing genocide during its colonial occupation of Namibia and announced financial aid worth more than €1 billion. However, the interconnected issues around honoring Witbooi, the colonial genocide, and the German reparations remain inconclusive and unresolved. So, for instance, colonial monuments in Namibia still represent uneven resources. Compare the statue in Windhoek of a German Schutztruppe soldier and the monument to Hendrik Vittbooi in his traditional stronghold, Gibeon. That's Gibeon. In South Africa, as in Namibia, Witbooi has become a rallying point for a redefined identity articulated by, amongst others, Simon Witbooi, a direct descendant. Known as the rap singer Hemelbesem, he has a large tattoo of his ancestor on the inside of his forearm. In his autobiography, God Speaks Afrikaans, he writes that he placed it there so that when he performs, Hendrik Vittbooi will be close to the microphone and will be able to speak through him. I will end with a short clip of a song called Witbooi by Hemelbesem. Hemelbesem's song is part of a more widespread re-evaluation of Witbooi in South Africa, Namibia, and the Netherlands. I'm searching for Hendrik Vittbooi by Piet van Rooyen, that would be the English title, and I Am Hendrik Vittbooi by Connie Braam. He is portrayed as a visionary political leader. The Emperor's Eagle over Namaland, Into the Distance, and We Are the Avengers all explore threads of shared ideology between the Herero and Nama genocide and the Nazi Holocaust, with reference to Hendrik Vittbooi and his descendants. To conclude, Sitting Bull has 2 graves, but it is possible that his bones are in neither. Witboi's grave was never found, and he is also honored with 2 empty graves, one in the Heroes Acre in Windhoek and one in Gibeon. These men are nowhere, and yet they are everywhere. Frederick Jameson, under the heading The Return of the Repressed, writes that Derrida's ghosts occasion moments in which the present, and above all our current present, the wealthy, sunny, gleaming world of the postmodern and the end of history, of the new world system of late capitalism, unexpectedly betrays us. The descendants of Sitting Bull and Hendrik Vittbooi are from tribes that were meant to be exterminated, but they are still there. They are still here. They are questioning the wealthy, sunny, gleaming American and European worlds of the present. From Gibeon in Namibia to Wounded Knee in North Dakota, The ongoing conversation between Sitting Bull and his descendants and Hendrick Vittboy and his descendants are geared toward the future and focused on reclamation and restitution. This illustrates Derrida's point that learning to live more justly can only maintain itself with some ghost, can only talk with or about some ghost, and that this being with specters is a politics of memory, of inheritance, and of generations. I wanted to play a 1-minute clip. I'm not sure that I can get there. Are you awake, Jessie? So to save time, I'm just picking up the song in the middle of all of it so that we can get to the chorus, and then I will leave. Yes. Yes.
Nina fulani kasmana li, uzel motu kala lankali, kaseka nafsiya melantani, yes unbelievable, somebody girl down to deep in the dust. The country is the love that I'm the belly down my people that house. Boy, but 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 boy.
Thank you very much for this helpful. I mean, it really links with what we heard this morning about spectrality goals. I'm sure we'll have plenty of questions, but we'll now listen to Nada Afiouni, who is a senior lecturer at Loire-Normandie University and a CI Migration Fellow. Her research focuses on cultural pluralism and religious minorities from cross-cultural perspectives. Her areas of specialization include funerary rituals in the context of migration, and particularly the funerary rituals, of Muslim minorities in France and Britain.
Thank you very much. We've been talking during those 2 intensive and very interesting days on death and migration, particularly on a micro scale. My talk echoes many of the talks that we've heard, but more particularly that of Maurice about grief and protest. But I offer a different perspective, both in time and place, but also a very different scale. Because the event I'm going to present now took place 19 years ago in Normandy, France, in 2003. These deaths did not take place on the other side of the globe, nor in the deep blue sea. Instead, they happened on the River Seine. This lovely romantic river was the stage of a drama where 3 men drowned a few kilometers from where the river flows to the sea. My main interest here is to focus on how these events were constructed and highlight the power and control the officials have over migrant bodies, whether dead or alive. I would also like to emphasize the role of undocumented migrant activism that made the difference at that moment for the 3 dead migrants. My talk will be thus structured around 3 main points. I will first outline the chronology of the events and the way they were reported on in the press. Then I will dwell on the central role played by Kader, and this is for you, Yumna. Kader is a fascinating character. He was a former undocumented migrant, and he played a key role in unveiling the presence of the corpse in the morgue. As I told you, he's a fascinating character. And if the topic of this conference was to be personified, it would be him. Kader was an Algerian. He had escaped death on many occasions before reaching Europe, and who had occupied for several years a job at Le Havre's morgue. He has today the French nationality and is an employee of the city in charge of the cemeteries. In the last part of my talk, I will underline that no matter the scale or the geographical location, the dead bodies are, as we put it in French, la patate chaude, the hot potato, the buck that is passed from one side to the other. The scale is of no importance, whether death takes place in the Mediterranean Sea, across the Channel, or in the River Seine. It is always a ping-pong game between the different protagonists to deal with the corpse. Inquiring about what happened 20 years ago was time and energy consuming. Moreover, I was taken aback by the deep emotion that surfaced in the interviews, even though the tragic event took place a long time ago. The chronology of this case in the media coverage was sketchy and sometimes contradictory. The fact that I'm going to narrate are a reconstitution of media coverage, local and national, but more particularly, they are based on the interviews I conducted with the local activists and the city officials. At first, the early stages of this story can seem common in a port area. On Monday, 29th of September 2003, 3 young men were arrested by the police, local police in Port-Jérôme, Notre-Dame de Gravenchon. So I'm going to say Port-Jérôme instead of saying the very long name of this town. So Port-Jérôme is an inland port on the river Seine, 30 kilometers away from Le Havre. The 3 young men were found walking along the river. Their clothes were soaked and they visibly suffered from hypothermia. They declared to the police that they were 4 to have jumped from the boat. The police went searching for the 4th man. He would be arrested a few hours later at a bus stop, soaked and shivering in the cold night. The 4 young men had obviously spent some time in the river. They were taken to the hospital by the local police forces. Then they were handed immediately to the PAF, la police aux frontières, the border police and immigration officials. The story could have ended here, but the next day, on Tuesday, 13th of September, an unanimated body was found on the border of the river at Tilbeuf. The tribunal, following the discovery of the dead body, initiated an investigation. The rumor ran very quickly that there have been more than 5 undocumented migrants on board of the Baltic Captain 1. It is the name of the ship that had moored on the river port. It had sailed, in fact, the Baltic Captain 1 had sailed 13 days ago from Conakry, Ghana. And according to the captain and crew, the presence of the stowaways went unnoticed on board. In the early press articles, the Guineans, because they were Guineans, they were referred to in the local press first as Africans or the Africans, and then after the body was found, their national origins was mentioned in the press. The news was published on the front page of the local newspaper, Le Havre Presse. The interrogation of the 4 survivors revealed that they were 7 on board the ship, and this was leaked immediately to the press, and as you could see, it appeared on the front line. Yet the préfet of the Seine-Maritime dismissed immediately and publicly the possibility of the presence of other illegal migrants on board, and described it as unfounded rumors. He ordered the halt of police searches for the potential other migrants, despite this growing rumor of the presence of others. These rumors were relayed in the national press, alluding to potential other victims. It first appeared as a news brief in Le Monde, then in Libération, then more extended articles, and then it spread in the Telegraph, in 20 Minutes, etc. 4 days later, a second corpse was found at Quillebeuf on the 6th of October. On the 9th of October, the third dead body was found floating on the river. So we have here 3 dead bodies that were found in less than 9 days. The press reported on these successive macabre discovery as if it was a bad thriller. Were they 5, if you could read, then the next day, maybe 7, and then in another press, unexpected drowned bodies. So an issuing mobilization took place in Le Havre, even though the events did not take place in the city's port. It was initiated by a group of undocumented migrants who had created a working collective named Le Collectif des Sans-Papiers in 2002, a year earlier. 2 other local associations, ACE and ACT, participated in their fight for legal residency rights. They were very active and visible in the city. In fact, they embraced the cause of the 7 Guineans and even struggled to provide help to the 4 survivors. They were quickly outraged by what they described as a shoddy and rushed investigation in which the captain was not held responsible and was cleared from any unlawful conduct. 2 out of the 4 Guineans who survived the incident were underage. They were 13 years and 15 years old, and could have easily been eligible to minor migrant protection. In spite of much effort, the associations were unable to get in contact neither with the survivors nor with the court-appointed lawyer. The migrants were very quickly transferred from the hospital to the court and from the court to a detention center, and the next step was the airport. The shipment company contributed in the expenses of their flight back to Guinea. 20 days later, on the 21st of October, the Sans-Papiers Association organized a posthumous tribute, an event combining commemoration and protest at the same time at Port Jérôme in the memory of the 3 drowned young men. It was clear in the mind of everyone present that day that the 3 bodies had been repatriated to Guinea. More than 250 people attended the ceremony that was organized. Most of the demonstrators were former or undocumented migrants. Some of them were regularized the same year. Candles were lit and placed in water so they floated away. A sense of total frustration and impotence was predominant because none of the associations were able, as I told you, to get in touch with the 4 that had managed to survive, but were nonetheless deported, even though they had reached France alive. The gathering was an intense emotional moment. They were mourning not only the loss of the 3, but also, and mainly I would say, the failed attempt of the 4 others to stay in France. One element was repeated by all the interviewees. We did not even get to know their names, not the names of the dead migrants, nor those of the survivors. It is as if they had never existed. In fact, since the tragic discovery of the 3 bodies, the Collectif de Sans-Papiers, in an attempt to catch the public eye and the press, organized several marches in the city of Le Havre. The marches were reported in the local newspapers and many articles were published. You have 2 of them here. And the articles were voicing the demands of the sans-papiers and their numerous unanswered questions concerning the deportation and the death of the Guineans. So you could see that the 2 subjects were always presented as being part of the same issue, the fight for legal documents, and on the other side, more light on the death of those 3 Guineans. And here we come back to Kader. One of the demonstrators who marched with the sans-papiers was Kader. As I mentioned earlier, he was an undocumented migrant who had obtained a legal status the same year. He started his first declared work contract, and he had loads of jobs, but none of them were declared. This was his first one. He was so happy about it. In Le Havre, in the morgue, in September 2004. This is where he discovered in the morgue 3 drawers containing 3 unidentified bodies. They were young and they were Black. So 1 year later, the migrants' dead bodies were still laying in Le Havre's morgue. The contrast between the hasty repatriation of the living and the oblivion of the dead bodies was striking. Judging from the interviews that I conducted with both Kader and the other activists, this discovery came as a double shock. They were grief-stricken twice, recalling the commemoration they had organized 1 year ago for bodies they genuinely thought were already buried in their country of origin, while in fact they were lying in Le Havre's morgue. In reaction, the association organized a new gathering on the annual anniversary on the 29th of September 2004, outside this time the building of port authorities. The revelation in the press of the presence of the corpse in the morgue embarrassed the political authorities, specifically in Le Havre, because the city of Le Havre was already in an intense fight with the Collectif des Sans-Papiers on other issues. But according to the French funerary law, the town where an unidentified body is found is legally obliged to cover for the expenses of his burial in its own cemetery. So the city of Le Havre had no obligation whatsoever to bury the dead ones because they died in Quillebeuf and Notre-Dame de Gravenchon. And it is, in fact, important at this stage to show you where the dead bodies were found. So the first 2 were legally considered deceased at Quillebeuf, and the third one was officially considered deceased in Port-Jérôme, Notre-Dame de Gravenchon. 2 small towns on the 2 sides of the River Seine. And as you can see, both had a right-wing political majority, so things could not be analyzed in terms of right-wing or left-wing authorities. I tried to investigate, in fact, the official document. And again, here, this is what Française was saying. It's not always easy to get access to the official documents. And I was officially denied access to the letter exchanged between the police, the morgue, and the 2 cities. Yet, one senior clerk in Port-Jérôme, who was in charge back in 2003, accepted anonymously to read out loud all the documents and the minutes of the investigation and the exchanged letters between the different administrations. So in the light of these readings, there is no doubt that in the immediate aftermath of the tragedy and after the police inquiry case was closed, both cities were unwilling to bury the bodies in their cemetery. Letters were sent from both cities. Letters were sent first to the Guinean consulate to ask for money to pay for the repatriation expenses. One of the arguments put forward in the letter that was read by the mayor is we would not want to deprive their family of this crucial moment of bereavement and grief. So that's why we ask you to participate in the repatriation of the bodies. The Kenyan consulate did not respond. And the bodies remained forgotten in the morgue. Yet, when this was revealed in the press, Yes, when this was revealed in the press of Port Jérôme accepted to welcome the body found on its territory. He was buried in what is called the temporary allotment, le caveau autonome. Each cemetery has one or several ones. It is, I call it the transit zone. It's a place where you put the body while waiting for a definite, for a more permanent spot. Meanwhile, on the other side of the River Seine, the mayor of Quillebeuf, who is senator also, by the way, maintained his refusal of burying the bodies. And this time in the letter, he was pretexting another aspect. And it is out of respect that he could not take those Guinean in his cemetery because, and I quote, how can we allow ourselves to bury them among Christians if we discover that they are finally Muslims? So, and in another letter, he also refused to take them in the cemetery because he would have to pay for the 20 months spent at the morgue because it costs money. Every day costs money. Finally, in June 25, the city of Port Jérôme decided to bury the two other Guineans in the city cemetery. The press was called, was present, and the body of the first migrant was removed from the temporary spot, and the three men were buried together in the same burial spot. And what is surprising is that the city renewed in 2020 the concession right for another 15 years and paid also for the maintenance of the grave. Even though the migrant's body, who was buried in Port Jérôme, has always been reported in the official document as Mr. X, or illegal immigrant from Guinea, or the African corpse, a name was given to him on the tombstone, Momo Camara, but not to his two friends. This inscription on the tombstone reinforces the absurdity of his death and of their collective death. In an attempt to normalize their presence in the cemetery's deathscape. I searched for their names, in fact, in the available data on missing migrants. And the death of three young men is listed in the migrant files as anonymous. They are absent from both the United List of Refugee Death and from Maël Gallison's database that lists migrant death from 1999 to 2021. I also found in a collection, in a book, in a novel published by Didier Daninck, who is a detective, who's an author of detective novels, one page of news brief concerning the death of those undocumented migrants. And I'm going to conclude, and it's not a conclusion, I'm going to just say this small sentence in order to stress the importance, in fact, the importance of the role played by the associations of sans-papiers, the active presence and the active mobilizations of those who did not die, of those who made it, in fact. And I think in this specific context of Le Havre, this is really what made the difference in finding a final resting place for Momo and his friends. Thank you.
Very much. It's really striking. I mean, I want to keep in mind the expression how the material body remains both at the same time a taboo and really.
We don't want to deal with it. We don't want to deal with it.
Yeah. So now we're going to listen to Henriette Korthals, who is assistant lecturer at Birkbeck College, University of London, and is a specialist in 20th and 21st French literature. So quite another perspective on our fields.
Yes, so first of all, yes, thank you very much for having me here. I obviously, as Marianne said, I'm coming from the perspective of French literature and French theory, and I've worked on mourning, so that's going to be my take on the topic today. I would like to also warmly thank all the panels we've got, because I learned a lot, obviously, and I have to say that a lot of questions have come up, and there are now many more question marks in my talk. And also starting with the title itself, which I'm going to, question mark, is Ai Weiwei talking for the dead or not? That's going to be the topic of my talk today. So, yeah. So what is now known and constructed as the Migrant Crisis only garnered public awareness in 2015, when the Syrian civil war caused a massive exodus and suddenly attracted wide journalistic coverage. What had been a long existing phenomenon and had simply escaped the public eye, whether willfully ignored or condoned, suddenly came into being in the media in the form of what are now stock images: long lines of fleeing migrants, hordes waiting by rail tracks, the ubiquitous makeshift camps littered with plastic, the transient but perhaps real community of the Calais jungle, the barbed wires of borders and surveillance cameras, or the Mediterranean no longer a motherly mare nostrum, but an aquatic grave. All images that stripped migrants of their status of exile or asylum seeker. And so one image, of course, we have talked about a lot, is the body of the Syrian toddler Alan Kurdi, washed ashore on the coast of Turkey. It crystallized all sorts of sentiment, emotion and affect, spoken or unspoken, from indignation to sympathy, shame and helplessness, which was perhaps best captured by the sand sculpture of the image of Alan Kurdi's body by Indian artist Sudarshan Paitnak. As a transient art form, it spoke about the transience of lives engulfed in the sea, but also of the very transience of the memory we bear of them. The words that accompanied it, humanity washed ashore, shame, 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 speak volumes, albeit obliquely, about human responsibility and perhaps its limits, the shame at being helpless in front of a moral disaster and the failure of international help. My aim in this paper is to look at representations of those who lost their lives during their flight, in particular in Ai Weiwei's much discussed documentary film, Human Flow. It indeed offers a comprehensive gaze of the migration crisis, as Ai Weiwei's productions team traveled across 23 countries, interviewed about 600 refugees, humanitarian workers, aid workers, and policymakers alike. My aim here is to read the film against Judith Butler's analysis of what makes a life grievable or not, as formulated in her groundbreaking work, Precarious Life, The Powers of Mourning, and her follow-up essay, Frames of War, When is Life Grievable? In Frames of War, Judith Butler famously posited a divide between the lives that are individualized and mourned, and those lives which are not grieved or grievable, simply because they do not qualify as lives. Such divide has defined the ways in which the Western policymakers have failed or succeeded in handing out humanitarian aid in situations of otherwise equal emergency. It is worth reminding that When is Life Grievable forms a follow-up to Precarious Life, The Powers of Warning, which exposed the politics of violence led by the Bush administration in the aftermath of 9/11, and construed it as an inability to mourn the deaths of the 9/11 victims, and therefore was a form of pathological mourning, as well as a helplessness, a form of melancholy gone awry. Criticism, in particular Ida Danavid, has argued that Judith Butler's foregrounding of grief, vulnerability and compassion as the bedrock for new forms of cosmopolitanism problematically maintains a post-colonial status quo in which the West reasserts a moral superiority and only pays lip service to an ethics of care it otherwise promotes. Likewise, if Human Flow has been critically acclaimed in the mainstream press as a documentary that shows the harrowing plight of 65 million migrants and the inconceivable extent of the crisis, academic criticism, however, has been quick to criticize the film for having given an individual voice mostly to policymakers and humanitarian workers rather than the refugees themselves, and thus maintaining Ai Weiwei's status as a celebrity artist. My aim in this paper will to examine hand in hand the criticisms addressed to Judith Butler and Ai Weiwei, as both are about a status quo that would maintain a supposed moral, ontological and existential superiority of the Western world or the globalized North on the one hand, and an artist over the refugees whose lives and deaths he documents on the other. My argument will seek to highlight how such criticisms are based on a number of what I see as misreadings of both Butler's and Ai Weiwei's works. I will show how the divide between the refugees and the onlooker, whether a humanitarian helper, activist, artist, or academic, like ourselves, remains an unsolvable conundrum. In the hope to overcome that impasse, I will take a step sideways and ask what we as onlookers or mourning and grieving when we are confronted with the images of the lives and deaths of refugees. So I would like to preface my talk with a few prefatory remarks about Judith Butler's essays, Frames of War, When is Life Grievable? She sets out her essay with the observation that some lives count as lives and are individuated and therefore mourned when lost, wherever others are not. If certain lives, so I'm reading her here, I'm quoting her here. If certain lives do not qualify as lives or are from the start not conceivable as lives within certain epistemological frames, then these lives are never lived nor lost in the full sense. This then begs the question as to what a life is, or in other terms, when is a life recognized as such? To answer the question, she posits that grievability is a presupposition for a life that matters existentially and politically. And so she continues to explain that without grievability, there is no life, or rather, there is something living that is other than life. Instead, there is a life that will never have been lived, sustained by no regard, no testimony, and ungrieved when lost. The apprehension of grievability precedes and makes possible the apprehension of precarious life. It may be argued that a life testified to or for when mourned and grieved is a ritual for the privileged that is not per se shared across cultures. But perhaps more crucially, Butler introduces the notion of precarious life. A precarious life, is synonymous to vulnerability, she tells us, and as such is the common denominator to all grievable life. It is uncertainty, vulnerability, and dependency on the care of others that defines lives in the first place. However, precarity, a condition resulting from war, social unrest, climate change, or other causes, however, makes a life more dependent on the care of all of us, be it the state or private help. Precarity, and therefore grievability, is unequally distributed in geopolitical terms. Judith Butler's notion that grievability is the presupposition for a life that matters, has taken prominence in refugee studies and international theory as a way to understanding why some lives count as less human or simply waste. Yet Butler's ethical turn has also encountered severe criticism. Some have talked about the Hamletization of politics, like Hendrik, with an avenger who has become reflective, melancholic, and incapable of action, she argues. Others, such as Laclau and Mouffe, have qualified Butler's position as a melancholic stance and exposed it as such as being a retreat from politics. Ida Danavid, with whom I think was discussed earlier today and yesterday again, also argued that grief, compassion, and identification with the migrants as the basis of a new form of activism and cosmopolitanism maintains a post-colonial status quo in which the Western world maintains a position of moral superiority over its former colonies. The latter remain locked up in the role of victim, and it perpetuates dependency towards a Western world comforted in its role as a dispenser of humanitarian help. She further argues that in the case of the recent work done on the Black Mediterranean, the ethical turn dehistoricizes the migrants' crisis and turns away from the complexities of historical and cultural interlocking. This is all the more surprising since Butler's concept of grievability rests precisely on a need to and call for a cultural and public mourning that would seek to reflect on the historical context, the US, and the country's possible indirect responsibility, or direct, perhaps even responsibility in the 9/11 attacks, which had become, the questioning of which had become a taboo, even if in the left-wing land or in the democratic lending newspapers such as the New York Times after the attacks. So I would like to underpin my proposition by retracing the argumentation Butler sets out in Precarious Life, and which she explicitly sees as a prequel to Frames of Work. Published, as I say, as I explained, it was published in 2004 in the wake of the politics of violence carried out by the Bush administration as a response to 9/11. In particular, the Patriot Act, a series of laws that allowed to restrict civil rights, and then, of course, the Iraq War. In the chapter Violence, Mourning, Politics, she reflects on how public mourning of the 9/11 period was rushed through, with President Bush declaring on the 21st of September, only 10 days after the events, that grieving was over and time had come for so-called resolute action. It is in this context that Butler enlists Freud's classic study on mourning and melancholia, in which he opposes normal mourning to melancholy, a form of pathological mourning. Normal mourning is a time-bound exercise. It seeks to understand what is mourned in the person we've lost or grieved for. It seeks closure in that understanding, which then supposedly would allow us to move forward and replace the lost object. Melancholia, by contrast, is unable to find closure. It refuses to readily settle for an answer to the enigma of that grief poses, as Butler reminds, and she's therefore led to ask, what is it to be gained, both on a personal and political level, from repudiating grief and mourning as the Bush administration did? If mourning is about understanding who one is in relation to those we've lost and what has been lost in those lives, then mourning is a process of self-understanding, whether we see it as narcissistic or not. It is the primary recognition that the subject and mourner is always dependent on others and vulnerable to losing them. Butler therefore continues to explain that the Bush administration's denial of grief and its rushing into a politics of violence is a form of melancholic refusal to understand and mourn through the political context that led to the 9/11 attacks. And the rushing into violence, into political violence, she furthermore construes as a refusal on the part of the administration to acknowledge its own vulnerability when precisely the country had, for the first time of its history, been attacked on its own territory. One thing I should add here, and which may be helpful in understanding what happened there, is that Freud also foregrounded ambivalence towards the lost object in his famous essay on mourning and melancholia. So again, if one is unable to conceive oneself without an idealized other, and therefore turns this ambivalence on oneself, leaving the subject depleted, divided, and guilt-ridden. This may again, I would say, help explain what Butler identified as the Bush administration's, or how the Bush administration banned any attempt to think of the 9/11 attacks in the context, let alone as a consequence of the US neocolonial politics. So sorry for this long, perhaps slightly too long preliminary remarks on Butler's work, but I wanted to show how this, in what historical context she wrote it. So this brings me to my next point, the representation of the bare lives and deaths in refugee camps. Let me say this again. This brings me to my next point, the representation of the bare lives and deaths in refugee camps, that what forms the barely hidden face of neocolonial and neoliberal forces. For that, I would like to focus on Ai Weiwei's film, Human Flow, which stands alone as a film, but which I propose to read together with his public art installations, The Life Vest from Safe Passage, and his restaging of Alan Kurdi's lifeless body on a Turkish shore. Okay. As I mentioned, I've lost my. As I mentioned, Ai Weiwei's Human Flow has been acclaimed for its ambitious scale, but on the other hand, it attracted criticism along the lines of the opposition drawn by Butler between the massive numbers of ungrievable lives of the obvious titular Human Flow, and on the other hand, those lives that are not grievable. Indeed, the film individualizes almost exclusively those who have political citizenship and social status. That is the doctors, the humanitarian workers, and policymakers. So you can see here, I mean, I've taken a few stills where you have these disindividualized lives of that are problematic, that problematically represents the refugees and the migrants. By contrast, the migrants are mostly represented, as I said, in anonymous groups, long lines of peoples, as I mentioned before. So my aim here is to possibly challenge this criticism by looking at the self-reflexive elements in Ai Weiwei's work. Self-reflexivity, I would say, cuts two ways. It can be seen as self-serving, but also as a means to ask an easy question. One of the obsessive questions I think that Ai Weiwei forces upon us is to what degree we, as onlookers, can identify with, and to what extent the viral circulation of violent images is indeed constantly calling upon our empathy, but that affective identification begs the question of its moral purpose when it is not followed by action or activism. This is perhaps what is most obviously at stake in his ambivalent and provocative act of restaging Alan Kurdi's life, a dead body. So that's the image we have here. What this image is probing, I would perhaps say or propose, is the authenticity of our empathy, or to what end or action we use it. Likewise, the celebrity selfies taken at this that we talked about today, which we touched upon 2 days ago, where Weiwei marshaled his guests to publish selfies of themselves wrapped in gold thermal blankets, again probes the same kind of question. The picture is even more problematic because of the promptness with which the guests executed themselves or complied with his demands, but also betrays their malleability and artist collusions with them. So it is, again, a way of staging, I would say, the divide between an unshareable suffering of the migrants and the privileged gala goers. Yeah. Sorry. So the question of identification with migrants is, I believe, compellingly treated as the film constantly scales in and out and zooms in and out of the grittiness and utter destitution of the migrants' lives, the camps, and so the way he uses parataxis, so that by that I'm constantly, the way the camera constantly shifts from distant shots of anonymized groups to close-ups of children or migrants, back again to very long and distant aerial shots that we've seen on the first picture, which give a sense of abstract, almost distant, shoot the problem as a globalized planetary issue, I would say. Again, here, I think underline the sense of helplessness of Ai Weiwei. Again, set against this grander and anonymous narrative, there are rare occasional cameos of individual lives and deaths that stand out more poignantly. On the one, so there is, of course, 12 minutes already into the film, into the documentary. We are shown a floating orange jacket drifting on its own as a metonymy of an absent body with no name, an understatement for a lonely death and a life lost to the sea that can hardly be mourned. On another occasion, Weiwei provides a short narrative that features a migrant named Ismatola Sediki, who tells how he lost his wife and children, who drowned in the sea. By way of obituary, he can only say their names, and by way of relics, he possesses only no more than their identity cards. This perhaps is the utter existential and subjective destitution of the migrant, being stripped of his right and capacity to mourn. So that's my last image, and no time to show the film here. So in conclusion, I would like to return to the initial question that I formulated in my introduction. What is it that we grieve for when we see the images of migrants that have gone viral, have been duplicated, commented upon, appropriated with pathos or irony, at the risk of either becoming fossilized, fetishized, or emptily formulaic? One answer may be political and embedded already in the film Human Flow, when Ai Weiwei shows how the Calais jungle is being destroyed, and at the same time he doubles that image with a newspaper title, "Europe is dead, long live Europe," which has taken from Der Spiegel. As the jungle is progressively being razed, an extract from the Charter of the Fundamental Rights of the European Union is then also superposed on that shot. The Union is founded on the indivisible, universal values of human dignity, freedom, equality, and solidarity. It is based on the principles of democracy and the rule of law. Ai Weiwei's telescoping of the destruction of the Calais jungle and the EU lofties but failed ambition is of course painfully ironic. Freedom, equality and solidarity, once the bedrock of European values, have now become deadlock. There is of course much more to it, but as Butler suggested in Precarious Lives not mourned personally, culturally and politically. Lives are not mourned personally, culturally and politically, there is always the risk of falling into a sterile melancholy that leaves the onlooker incapable of acting, or a melancholy gone astray that takes the form of violence and war. Thank you.